Hello, everyone. My name is Carol Lee Rafferty, the Managing Director of Yale Center Beijing, and I want to welcome all of you to this Yale Center Beijing Zoom event on Superpower Interrupted, the Chinese History of the World, a book discussion with Michael Schuman and the future of US-China relations with Stephen Roach. As some of you may know, the Yale Center Beijing was founded in 2014 as Yale University's first and only university-wide center in the world. And throughout the year, we host almost 200 events that feature faculty, students, and alumni from all 14 schools of Yale University. Today, we are privileged to have Michael Schuman and Stephen Roach speak to us on such an important topic. Just a bit of background, Michael Schuman is a seasoned journalist and author who has lived and worked in Asia since 1996. His new book, Superpower Interrupted, The Chinese History of the World, was released in June 2020 by publisher Public Affairs. His earlier works include Confucius and the World He Created, and the Epic Story of Asia's Quest for Wealth. Mr. Schuman has been a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine, and he currently is a contributor to The Atlantic, Bloomberg Opinion, and other publications. Today, we also have the distinct pleasure to have Dr. Stephen Roach join us. He is the Senior Fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute of Global Affairs and a Senior Lecturer at the Yale School of Management. He was formerly Chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia and the firm's Chief Economist for the bulk of his 30-year career at Morgan Stanley. His opinions, articles, and books such as Codependency, Unbalance, the Codependency of America and China, read by leaders from Beijing to Washington, D.C., and we're honored to have both of them join us today. Today, due to this format, what we're going to do is start with a moderated discussion where I will ask Michael and Steve questions for about 40 minutes and then open the floor up for questions from the audience. And without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Michael Schuman and Stephen Roach. And I will start with the first question for Michael. Let's see, let me try to mute you. Michael, I have read Superpower Interrupted and have found it to be fascinating and
thank you.
Timely read for these times when there are so many challenges between US and China and the rest of the world. I want to start by asking you what motivated you to write this book and what were the challenges that you had writing this book as someone who grew up and was educated in the West?
Yeah, first, thanks, Carol, and everybody at the Yale Center, and to Stephen for participating and planning this today. It's great. I appreciate it. What motivated me to write this book is, I think more than ever in the last 6 months with the pandemic and what's going on with the United States and China and all the economic issues and strategic issues that, China is playing a bigger and bigger role in the everyday lives of basically everybody in the world and especially Americans. And I feel that if these two countries are going to find a way forward, then they need to know a lot more about each other. And I feel when I watch the discourse around the world about China, I feel it's very much lacking in kind of depth and context, and that was kind of the driving purpose behind the idea. And I also wanted to kind of highlight the way that people, this relates to your second part of your question, highlight the way that people learn and see history. I think we tend to learn history, a history that is most connected to us, whoever we are and wherever we're living in the society that we're in. For example, I went to high school in New Jersey. I just went to a public high school, a pretty good high school. But my choices for history were I could take American history or I could take American history, and other parts of the world kind of floated into this narrative when they became relative to that story. But you only got little cameo appearances, and unless you really kind of sought out what was happening in other parts of the world. And I think everybody and whoever they are learns history in that way, and that we don't even realize how we see events today through a certain prism and a certain perspective that is that's created by the history that we've been taught. And I think and that actually leads to one of the difficulties of writing a book like this. I mean, I wanted to try to write a history of the world and world events and from China's perspective. But then you get into this issue of, okay, what in the world does a Chinese view mean, or what is a Chinese perspective? Because obviously, that changes over time. We're always reinterpreting our history, rewriting history, re-understanding history. So it's like, and obviously the Chinese society of today and people today, are not really much like what Chinese people were 1,000 years ago, or let alone 2,000 years ago. So, what's a Chinese view? So what I decided to do is I decided to kind of tell this through Chinese writers over time. So when I'm talking about, the Han Dynasty, for instance, or whatever, I tried the best I could to focus on the writing of the time, what people then were saying about the events that going on around them, whether it was historians or scholars or poets or philosophers, whoever it was, and so that way you were getting a view of how people felt within their own historical context. So it's not perfect, but it's kind of one way of avoiding this. Well, how people today can sometimes go back and see history differently than what it actually was, and try to kind of learn try to kind of present the Chinese experience as it was unfolding.
Thank you, Michael. And the title, Superpower Interrupted, that implies that China is resuming its place as a historic superpower. To what extent do you think the current China is a continuation or resumption of China in the past? And to what extent do you think the current China is diverging from the old China?
Well, there is a way of seeing the current government, as something of a successor state to all these old dynasties. I mean, it's what's really remarkable about Chinese history, I think, is not that China was always a superpower, every single year, every single century, but how often the political elite of China were able to overcome catastrophes and rebuild China into a great power over and over and over and over again. I mean, that's really what's amazing about Chinese history. And, if you put what's going on today in that context, you can see the rise of China as something of another imperial restoration. Obviously, this government does not would never describe itself quite that way. But, Xi Jinping, talks a lot about history. And I think he has a sense of history. And I think he's trying, unlike his predecessors, to put the communist government into that long historical narrative of Chinese greatness. I mean, what is the Chinese dream? It's a vague idea, actually, but when you think about it, it's really about a restoration of Chinese greatness on the world stage. I think the way that this government is different. I mean, of course, in the language and the form, being that it's not an imperial dynasty. You don't have, an imperial family and that kind of thing. But I think even more so, the world has changed. I mean, one of the aspects of the interruption in my title. It's not just Chinese power was interrupted, but the whole kind of Chinese world was interrupted by the rise of the West. That China kind of always has operated in an East Asia that worked kind of on a Chinese system of diplomacy and trade, and that was kind of wiped out by the rise of the West and the trouble that China's had in the last 200 years. So I think what's really different is that China is rising in a global environment that's significantly different than what previous dynasties, when they were rising, what they were encountering. And I think that's a very serious challenge for the government today.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Stephen, always a pleasure to have you speak for Yale Center Beijing, and thank you very much for joining. Why do you think it is important for those in the West to read Superpower Interrupted and understand the world from the Chinese perspective?
Well, thanks for the question, Carol. And Michael, thanks to you for writing a really outstanding book. It's not only a deep dive into history from China's perspective, but it's remarkably well put together. Your writing style is casual and very easy to follow at times, and at other times it's really got extraordinary depth.
Well, thank you.
I found it a really a great.
Thanks,
read.
I really appreciate that, Stephen. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure. So, I have been focused on China myself now for about 30 years, and a real wake-up call for me came when I read a book by then Yale professor, historian Jonathan Spence, published in 1998, called The Chan's Great Continent, or the subtitle was China in Western Minds. And I have to confess that, back when I read it in the late 90s, I was very puzzled by China. I was heading up a large economics team at Morgan Stanley, and we had a highly ranked team of economists, but we had no idea what was going on in the midst of this wrenching Asian financial crisis in 97, 98. And so I had been to China a few times, and I started going on a regular basis in 1997, in late 1997. And I became fascinated with China, but I have to say I didn't really fully grasp the misplaced perspective that we in the West had about China until I read, I probably didn't read it until 1999, the Spence book. And the basic thesis, and I hate to tell you the ending before you read it, because it's still a great book, and it is that he traces Western perceptions of China from Marco Polo's 13th century travel journals through American writers like John Steinbeck to politicians like Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and found the overarching theme that these brilliant Western observers largely saw China through the same lens, through the same mirror that they see themselves. To give you an example, Polo wrote of, all these beautiful canals that laced through 13th century Peking. When in fact, Spence was able to, through his great skills as a forensic historian, identify that there were no canals in Peking in the 13th century. They were to come later. But Polo confused the canals with Peking with those of his native Venice. And I won't take you through all the other remarkable distortions that Jonathan Spence uncovered in his forensic history of these Western views of China. But what Michael is doing, I think, is really building on this misplaced perception and giving us a full-blown assessment of not just the biases that the West has in assessing China, but how the Chinese actually viewed themselves over time. And as he just indicated, he uses a lot of the poetry and writings of ancient China to illustrate so many of the important themes that are evident over the centuries and centuries of history that he traced. And he found some I thought, some remarkable coincidences with terms that are being used today. You use this phrase at one point, maybe in your discussion of the Ming Dynasty, about Chinese exceptionalism. And, this is the China view that they were truly an extraordinary society and a nation unlike any other. I'd like to just come back to that in a second, though. And had really achieved the pinnacle of success from the standpoint of their creative system of so many historic and remarkable inventions, as you trace out not just gunpowder, but paper, and then of course you underscore their greatest invention of all, maybe tea, and the trouble that led China into near the problems that arose in the late Qing dynasty. But Chinese exceptionalism, I mention that because now, we're in the midst of assessing American exceptionalism in a world where we're not quite as exceptional as we used to be. And so I'm struck that, here's a book about China from the Chinese perspective. And I put that together with Jonathan Spence, who stressed that we always saw China through the same lens that we saw ourselves. Maybe there's some aspects of China's perception that might be helpful to us in diagnosing our own issues. The final thing I'd say, Carol, in response to your question is the idea that Michael poses, as the superpower interrupted. When I think of the word superpower, I think certainly of, nations on a comparative basis. And in the world that China was so important in, prior to the interruption of the late Qing dynasty that stretched through, say, the late 1970s, early 1980s, it was pretty hard to make the types of comparisons between powers that the concept superpower implies. There's no question that China was strong, certainly relative to where it had come from, and with the benefit of objective comparisons that historians can make, you could certainly draw relative comparisons between China and, say, Europe, as Michael did very effectively. But when we think of superpowers today, we think of competition, nations, countries, governments staring each other in the eye and really going toe-to-toe in the tough realm of geopolitical strategy and actions. And so the idea of a superpower today is very different than it was back then, and I think that's an important distinction. So I'll stop on that point, Carol.
Great, thank you. As a follow-up, given that many government and business leaders from the West or from China seek your advice on policies and economic development, how do you think the West's ignorance or misunderstanding about China's history has shaped its policies and attitudes toward China, especially in recent years?
Well, it's pretty clear that certainly in the U.S., there's a deep view that China poses an existential threat to American prosperity. This is a view that's been articulated very much so by President Donald Trump and by many of his senior advisors. And the question that I've raised and I've written about, and I've talked to several groups over the years at the Yale Center in Beijing, is how much of this threat is really a reflection of our own failings in terms of economics, politics, and society. And why is it that when we feel threatened, we need to find someone else to blame for the pressures that are being brought to bear on us? Just go back 30 years ago, the threat was Japan. And the economic arguments are similar. American jobs were under pressure. We had a big trade deficit. The biggest piece of the trade deficit was with Japan. And we put enormous pressure on Japan to revalue its currency, the yen. The Japanese did it and made a series of blunders after that that have left them mired in stagnation for 3 decades. We're viewing China through a similar type of scapegoat type blame game lens in the economic realm today. But you know, the Chinese, they've studied the lessons of the experience of Japan, and they're not making the same mistakes that the Japanese made. So, you know, the question you raise is very important, and you know, it's important to put you know, China in a perspective that is related to the experience of other countries as well as to the experience of nations like the United States that are experiencing a good deal of difficulty right now.
Thank you, Steve. I want to ask both of you, what to you is the most glaring blind spot that the West has about China and vice versa? Michael, if you want to share first.
Okay, I'll start. Well, I think, you know, this is actually touching on some stuff that Dr. Roach was talking about, which is, you know, the way that when you hear the discourse in the U.S. about China, not just now, but over the past, you know, 30, 40 years, it's all about, oh, China's an emerging market. How do we fit China into our world system. So we've always talked about China within the context of the world that kind of we in the U.S. have created for ourselves. And when you flip things over and you see things from China's perspective, these issues look quite different. For China's not so much an emerging market. China is basically in the Chinese eyes is simply returning to its place in the world that it had traditionally held for very long periods of time. So it's almost like a return to the norm. Not that there's something new emerging. It implies there's something incredibly new about it, and maybe it's new in the context of the last 100 years, but it's not really new in the context of Chinese history. It's the same thing with the U.S. kind of world order. I think what Americans don't understand is that the Chinese had for a couple thousand years had their own ideas about how the world should operate, how diplomacy should work, how trade should work, and for the most part in East Asia, the region more or less played by those rules. This was what is East Asia? East Asia is kind of a Chinese cultural zone where there were common bonds of ideas and education and language, but I find that from a Western perspective, I think very often our knowledge or our history of China picks up with the Opium War, which obviously is an important part of Chinese history, but it's just one aspect of China. So I think in the West, if we looked farther back in history and tried to understand how China operated in the world and the role that China had in the world, we'd be having a different conversation and asking different questions. On the flip side of that, I think the Chinese not the Chinese, in state media and other government forms of communications, you see kind of honestly something of a disdain for the U.S. from a cultural standpoint. You'll see stuff like, "Oh, we have 5,000 years of history, and you've been around for like 150 years. So, what do you know?" And obviously, that's Western civilization goes back quite a long way. When Confucius was teaching, so was Socrates in Greece. So it's I think that from the Chinese perspective, I think that they need to go back and read a little bit more about the depth of Western civilization and the ideas that have been formed. And honestly, I think in the American context, I think it would help Chinese leaders if they read about the American founders more and the ideals that drove the American founders. American ideals and values are not talking points. They actually really mean something in the American psyche and American politics, and to American people more broadly about human rights and democracy and openness. I don't know, maybe Xi Jinping and his top officials should all go see Hamilton or something as a starting point, or something like that. I think it would help. I feel sometimes the Chinese government sees these ideas as kind of ways of pressuring China, and not something that actually really holds value to Americans in a real concrete way.
And Steve, what do you think?
Well, I have to definitely agree with Michael. I think a viewing of Hamilton would be very important. It is available, of course, now live stream on Disney Plus everywhere in the world, except in China, which does not allow you to live stream on most Western media platforms. And we joke about that, but actually that's a big issue for me. Here's China has forget about the 5,000 years of history that Michael has written so brilliantly about. Just look at modern China right now, and the tightening of censorship that has occurred under Xi Jinping. if China is as strong as it is a nation right now, and I think it's quite strong, and it's come so far, I think it would benefit immensely from having and demonstrating to the rest of the world that it has enough self-confidence to tear down that that wall, as Reagan said to Mr. Gorbachev when he looked at the Berlin Wall in the late 1980s. And I think China has nothing to be fearful of in terms of opening up its own internet platform to the discourse and exchange of ideas that occurs in the West. They may not like everything they see. I don't like everything I see on the internet. That's for absolutely certain. But for a nation that's come as far as it has, I think you know, that would be important. And to answer your question, though, Carol, you know, the blind spots in the West. One of the first things I learned about China that I felt was extremely critical and became my anchor in answering a lot of economic and social questions that popped up during my education on China, is the importance of stability, economic stability, social stability, of course, political stability, and financial stability. And so I do not think that the West really understands how critically important China's desire to maintain stability in all of its many dimensions really is. And just take, you know, the most contentious issue today that China may be embroiled in, and that is Hong Kong. Hong Kong it's now been, you know, a year since this latest round of demonstrations have broken out, and they started out large, massive demonstrations, but very peaceful, aimed at the extradition law that was introduced by the chief executive, Carrie Lam. And then the escalation of the demonstrations took off exponentially, and what started out as peaceful became destructive, with wanton violence bordering on anarchy. And Hong Kong, a part of China, one country, two systems to be sure, was a source of instability. And so the government, the People's Republic of China, waited for its legislative cycle, showed actually a great deal of patience relative to what was written about in the West, and now has enacted a very controversial national security law. The Western view is that, you know, this is you know, the brute force of China showing disregard for human rights and for the compact that was signed and implemented over the handover in 1997. But if you see it as an act of trying to maintain social, political, and possibly even economic stability, you would have a different perspective. I'm not saying which perspective is right or wrong, but we tend to miss that and the significance of that in assessing China in many, many characteristics. And I would just use that Hong Kong example as a very important one right now. There are many, many others.
Thank you to both of you. And another question for both of you. In the past, East Asian and Southeast Asian countries have long adopted rules of engagement that were defined by the Chinese for centuries. And we saw that the West has been and is resistant to them and has tried to change them through diplomacy and in the past through war. Today, the West appears to be resistant toward an ascendant China that's looking to shape the new international rules of engagement. Are we bound for conflict? And what are the historical lessons that the world should heed? Steve, Michael?
Well, I'm not one of these destined for war guys. Actually, I don't think these things are inevitable. But you know, I think what the U.S. and China are facing here is, you know, again, going back to something we were just talking about. You know, the U.S. tend to talk about China as, you know, how do we fit China into our world? And I think what's becoming increasingly clear is that China doesn't necessarily want to be a part of the U.S. world, or at least not in the way that the U.S. expected. And I think it's bewildering in Washington, because when you think about it, you know, what other country has benefited more from the U.S. global system than China? It's very hard to come up with another country. You know, it's and so I think this has created some confusion in Washington. And so, well, what is China doing? Why doesn't China like the rules of the game that have done so much for China in terms of its economic growth and its rise of power on the world stage? And I think when you look back at history, what you find is that there's a pattern of this, that the Chinese as a society have tended to like to interact with the outside world on their own terms. And when they were not able to do that, they didn't like it very much, and they kind of waited for a moment when they were strong enough to kind of reassert their own view of the world. And, you know, this goes all the way back to the Han Dynasty. When you think about, like, you know, the early days of the Han Dynasty, they were confronted by another great power, the Xiongnu Confederacy, a steppe power in the north, and actually were much militarily weaker at that point. And this forced the Han Dynasty, only a few years after its founding, to sign an agreement with the Xiongnu in which the Han Dynasty was effectively paying tribute. They didn't call it that, but that's basically what it was in return for peace. And it wasn't perfect, but it actually sort of worked, and it kept things stable, and it really wasn't that expensive. But the Han court and the political elite really didn't like it anyway. A lot of them didn't like it anyway, and they felt that it was basically an embarrassment, a travesty. That how can the Chinese emperor, you know, lower himself in this way relative to a foreign power, and this basically led to a series of events where the Han Dynasty tore up this agreement, went to war, a very costly war, a war that they won, but the war that they wanted at great expense. And you'll see this pattern happening over the years as well, with this constant need to kind of create the rules of the game through which China interacts with the world. And I think to a certain extent, that's what's going on right now. It's hard to tell what form this is exactly going to take, but, you know, Xi Jinping has talked openly about creating a new form of foreign relations. China just doesn't want more influence in the current world system. China wants to alter and change that system in ways that it finds more appropriate for its own interests. And I think that's something that people in Washington and Europe have to figure out what to do about. The idea that you're going to somehow stop China from doing these things may not really be the way to go. I think it's more of how do you preserve the American system and its values and still create space for a China that sees things differently.
Thank you. And Steve, war or not? Cold War or not?
Well, first of all, I just want to commend Michael. You know, throughout the book, he really does develop the point he just summarized very, very effectively, that China has its own perception of the world order, its own perception of its national value characteristics that it places the most importance on. And that is sort of always the negotiating point that China has with its adversaries that it encounters through trade and through other means around the world. I have sort of framed this differently. In a book I wrote a few years ago, I looked at the US-China relationship through the lens of an amateur psychotherapist who diagnosed this relationship as one of codependency, where both nations actually depended on one another from an economic point of view. China, of course, depended on the United States as its major source of external demand to drive its export-led development miracle. And the US, and this is very much at odds with the sort of conventional thinking in Washington right now, the US actually was very dependent on China for providing low-cost goods that income-constrained American consumers really needed to make ends meet. And China also ended up being the largest buyer of US treasuries, which is going to be very, very important as our budget deficits are going to require us to issue more and more treasuries than we ever dreamt imaginable in the years ahead. So codependency is sort of a framework to express this two-way reliance that each nation had on one another. And, you know, getting back to the psychology of it, when you study the literature, as I did in writing this book on codependency, you find that invariably one of the partners, for reasons we can't always identify, decides to break away from the other. And that sort of leaves the other partner feeling scorned and left behind. And therein sows the seeds of conflict. In the case of US-China, from the economic perspective that I looked at, China changed the rules of engagement beginning sort of around 2007, beginning to move away from export-led growth to growth focused on internal private consumption. And that sort of destabilized a very convenient dynamic that the US had relied on, and left the US uncomfortable, because the US was not changing its own approach to economic growth. So like, you know, the sort of the human pathology, China felt scorned to some extent, and excuse me, the US felt scorned to some extent, and the US lashed out at China, and that has escalated dramatically with the trade war triggered by the Trump administration. So codependency is inherently destabilizing and conflict prone if one partner changes and the other doesn't. And the only way to avoid conflict is that both partners have to be healthy in embracing change. China has been aggressive in changing its growth model we have been aggressive in defending and not changing our growth model. And so the tensions, the conflict, I think, is very much evident as a result of that today.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing this framework of codependency and what you see as kind of whether you embrace the change or the future or not. I want to ask you more specifically, recently you've written a number of articles on the coming crash of the dollar, which have been widely circulated. How do you think the roles of the US and Chinese currencies in the global economy and financial markets will evolve over time?
Well, I'll be brief on this because I want to really recognize that, you know, we want to come back to this extraordinary book, but, you know, Superpower Interrupted, sometimes it makes me wonder when I saw that title, when I first saw the title, I mean, I knew what Michael was writing about. He was kind enough to send me galley proofs, but, you know, you could have used the same title to write about the United States, Michael. Maybe that's your next, you've got a series of these books planned, and that'll be the next one to come. But, you know, when this pandemic broke out and you know, the world got locked down and the global economy collapsed for a few months and is still sort of bouncing off the bottom, but very, very weak right now. Financial markets have come roaring back, largely because central banks have injected more liquidity into markets than we've ever seen, any of us, in our lifetimes. But, you know, unlike most, I think there's more to the story than, you know, just the central banks can fix anything and everything. I think something has got to give. And so what I thought about during, you know, when you're in a lockdown and you don't go anywhere, you know, you have a lot of time to think. So, you know, I have spent more time thinking since mid-March probably than, you know, all the earlier years of my life put together. And so what struck me was that what's going to give here is that the United States, which has never been known for its giant reservoir of saving, was going to go deep in the hole in terms of its domestic saving. And that was going to trigger a current account deficit, the likes of which we've never seen. And that would come at a time when the dollar had been rising steadily, not just since the coronavirus broke out, but really since the end of 2011, the dollar's up close to 30%. And so I thought that what would give here, you know, maybe not the equity markets, maybe not the bond markets, but I thought the currency markets would give. And so I felt that that would be a fairly dramatic repricing of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And what clinched it for me was that, you know, currencies are relative prices. So it's not just the current account and the lack of domestic savings. That might be enough for some countries. But in the case of the US, we have lost and abdicated the mantle of global leadership. You know, and this gets back to the point that I made earlier about Michael's notion of Chinese exceptionalism. We have prided ourselves in American exceptionalism. And it's turning out that we are leading the world in deglobalization, decoupling, moving away from supply chains, trade protectionism. We've had the worst performance of any major country in the world with respect to containing the coronavirus. It's appalling what's going on right now in the United States. And we're in the midst of a profound and historic racial upheaval. So the lack of American exceptionalism in conjunction with a precipitous decline in national savings in our current account tells me the dollar is going to fall a lot. So I wrote about that, and I received volumes and volumes of hate mail that reminded me of my career on Wall Street when I was working at Morgan Stanley.
Thank you, Steve. And given the time, one last question before I open up the floor to the audience to ask you questions. How do both of you think the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted China's role in the world today? How is it hastening or altering the course on which China has embarked to reassert itself as a superpower? Thank you.
Well, it's pretty obvious how the Chinese government thinks that the pandemic has affected China's role in the world, because you see it in what's become an almost daily barrage of propaganda out of various state outlets, touting the wonders of the Chinese virus fighting system, and from there taking the next step and saying that the Chinese governance system is superior to others, especially to the United States and the U.S. democratic system, and therefore this means that China is ready for world leadership, that China is a more responsible global citizen. You'll see in this propaganda an amazing amount of rather aggressive jibes at Donald Trump, the way he's managing the pandemic, the failures of the United States, the failures of an open society, and then on the other side, these same outlets kind of saying, well, while the U.S. has lost the confidence of the world, look at how China's success has built confidence that the virus can be conquered. So I think the Chinese government clearly sees this as an opportunity to gain, I guess, soft power, which is something else Xi Jinping talks about all the time, which is something that China always had in large amounts, and that what we were talking about earlier, that civilizational pull, the civilizational bond that China had with its neighbors, was a very important part of its power. Xi Jinping knows the importance of this soft power, and they see this as a big soft power opportunity. I'm not sure it's working. When you look at the response from many countries around the world, what seems to be rising hostility towards China, I think this approach has come off as insensitive. Although people are dying and other countries are suffering through a pandemic that China had a role in starting, and the tone of this propaganda often comes off, I think, as gleeful that other countries are having problems compared to China, and I'm not sure that the campaign is actually achieving what the government, I think, wants to achieve.
And Steve?
Well, actually, I think Michael put it very well, Carol. China's role in the origins of the COVID-19 are very controversial. There's no question about it. I've written about it, and others have. But the one thing I would add that Michael didn't focus on is that in political circles in the United States, the Republican members of the Senate, and as well as the Trump administration, are focusing on the virus as a key strategic element of the looming presidential campaign. And there was a strategy document prepared by the leading consulting group, a group called O'Donnell and Associates, prepared for the GOP, the Republican Senate, and it was leaked by Politico in April of this year. It's a 57-page document titled, and I have a copy of it if anybody wants it, called the Corona Big Book. And the bottom line of this strategy is that if Trump is attacked for mishandling COVID, and he certainly is being attacked for that right now, the more he's attacked, you do not defend Trump, according to this document, you attack China. And so the more that we fail to address this coronavirus, the more you hear these, the president once again is resurrecting these racial slurs in referring to the origins of the virus. The Republicans are threatening sanctions on Hong Kong, and now sanctions related to the Uyghur issues in Xinjiang province. The greater the failure of the Trump administration in addressing our strain of the virus. And let me tell you that right now the failures are mind-blowing. I mean, we have outbreaks that are exploding in the Southwest, West Coast, and even the Southeast. And we have first-line healthcare workers who do not have enough in the way of PPE equipment to deal with their patients. It's appalling. We don't have enough testing. We have lines, people waiting in lines overnight in their cars to get tested for COVID. I mean, our performance is doesn't even qualify as a high-level third world performance. It's humiliating. And so in the face of that, and in the pressure that's being brought to bear on the Trump administration, we're attacking China more and more and more. And you'll see more of that. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but it was a point I wanted to get out into the open anyway.
No, it's really fascinating, and thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. Now I'm going to turn to my colleague Devin Lau, who's based in New Haven, our program director, to lead the Q&A session. And I would like to ask all of you in the audience who can to please turn on your video cameras if you haven't already, because it's always more engaging for us and our speakers to see which audience to which they're speaking or whose questions they're responding to. Thank you. And now I'm turning this over to Devin. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Steve and Michael as well, for what has already been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure there are tons of questions that people are eager to ask. So this is how it'll work. If people have questions, please feel free to either use the chat function on the bottom of the Zoom screen to type out your question, or raise your hand under the participants button, and we will do our best to call on you, and you can directly ask your question to either of the panelists. So if anybody has questions, again, please feel free to type it on the chat function or raise your hand, and I will be sure to call on you. Okay, so it looks like Kathy Xu has a question. Okay, well, because not. But basically, Kathy's question, and this can go to either of the panelists, is the Chinese premier said recently there are about 600 million Chinese whose income are around 1,000 RMB a month. So with this figure in mind, the question is, can China still make a rightful claim as a superpower when so many people are living in relative poverty, I guess?
Poverty. Well, you know, I don't think China has fully restored the pillars of its power. China is still an up and coming power, not a superpower quite yet. That process is still going on. I mean, when you look at the past pillars of Chinese power, it was very often economic. You know, China has been for much of history one of the world's largest economies, and again is the world's second largest economy, but it's still not an advanced economy. It's still not in the rich nations club. There's a lot more work to be done there. Politically, again, you know, China extending its power around the world, but you know, what Beijing says about global issues still doesn't carry the same weight of, let's say, what people in Washington have to say about global issues. And then on the soft power, on the cultural front, we were talking about, that's one that, I mean, even when China was politically and militarily weak, that civilizational pull was always there, and that kind of was a way that China was able to maintain its power through periods of political weakness, and I think that's an area where China has really not caught up yet. You know, it's Chinese society itself, I think, is first having a bit of an awakening to its own traditional culture. Xi Jinping talks about this all the time, and I think he wants to kind of reconnect with China's neighbors in the way that China used to, based on these civilizational bonds. But we're not really close to that yet. So yes, so you're right. China is a superpower in the making if the trends continue in the direction that they're going. Of course, there's no guarantee of that either. You know, nothing's certain about economics, or, you know, it was Benjamin Franklin who said, I think nothing is certain but death and taxes. And becoming a superpower, I don't think was on his list. So we tend to talk about China's rise as if it's inevitable. That actually is not the case, or at least not the case at this moment. So this government has a lot more work to do.
Steve, did you want to add to that?
No, why don't we go to the next question? I thought that was a terrific answer. I agree with what Michael said.
Great. Rick Ward here has a question. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Basically, my question has to do with the people and leadership in China having a worldview based on information that's available to them, and people in the American side also having access to certain sorts of information and views and belief systems that promulgate there. Those are two different worldviews. So how they might lead to misunderstanding, and what are the risks of that kind of misunderstanding, and where are those risks most profound? That's my question.
Well, I'll take a stab at that, Rick.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic question. It really is. And I think there are two parts to the question, and that is, what information do both sides really have? I mean, do they have access to common facts, or do they have access to very different perspectives of their adversaries, or even their own economy? And then secondly, the second aspect of it is, let's just assume that they're both operating on the same information basis. do they then have different approaches by which they apply that information to achieve their objectives? I think really the question turns most critically on the second aspect of this, because I'd like to think that, notwithstanding censorship and edited data, and the Americans have always been suspicious of Chinese economic data and so on and so forth, that to a large extent we are operating on the basis of relatively common sets of information. I mean, our statistical system is very transparent. We publish most of our numbers. And the Chinese have huge teams of people that pore over all of the publicly available information they get from the US. Some would say they go too far and extract information from us that we would not otherwise like to have them have. But notwithstanding that, I mean, the US also has countless people that are poring over aspects of information that pertain to China's economy, its military capabilities, satellite imagery of activities, in the South China Sea, for example. The question is what we do with it and how we use that on the Chinese side and on the US side. And that really reflects very different aspirational objectives that both nations have in terms of addressing their problems at home, but also addressing their role in the world. And so I think, that's where your question really forces us to think the hardest. And, those are answers that, that can be debated actively. And, again, I just go back to Michael's book. If China aspires to resume its historic role as a superpower, which, as Michael already indicated, in many respects is the essence of what Xi Jinping has called the China dream, then, that application of information takes on very different purposes than, a China that might have operated as it did under Deng Xiaoping, which was thought to be to hide your strength and bide your time. So we have to really figure out what, where China is going in terms of its ambitions as the reascendant superpower. And we also have to do the same for the United States. But thank you. That was a terrific question.
I'd like to take a stab at that a little bit differently. I agree. I agree with Dr. Roach. But I think the other thing is, as Stephen was mentioning earlier about the Republican Party's view on the how to use how to deal with the coronavirus problem in the campaign. History and information can be made what you want it to be, and that's happening on both sides. I mean, when you look at, for example, China can see the West in two very, very different ways. One, you could focus on the Opium War and this kind of century of humiliations. The other history is really the amazing things that have happened through a partnership with the West over the last 40 years. What I find in the messaging from the Chinese government is there's a lot more focus on what happened in the 19th century than what happened 20 years ago. The Chinese press talks about the Opium War like it happened 2 weeks ago. I mean, that's not to diminish the importance of the event, but if the Chinese government wanted to have a different relationship with the West, they could focus on the last 40 years and all the great things that have happened. And you almost never see that mentioned. I mean, when the Communist Party talks about the economic rise of China, you don't really hear you don't get a thank you to Washington and other countries for the way that the incredibly important, probably defining role that they played in China's economic rise. But instead, what you hear about are the humiliations that the Chinese suffered at the hands of the West. This is a political decision by the Communist Party and its leadership to focus on a certain aspect of China's relationship with the West for its own political purposes, and that's creating a certain foreign policy narrative and a certain impression of the Chinese people towards the outside world that this is a conscious decision. So I think both countries are using history and using storylines for political purposes that aren't actually the best thing for the relationship.
Thank you, Michael. That's a very insightful answer that I think actually anticipates some of the upcoming questions as well. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to kind of condense some of those questions into sort of more of a general question and have you guys address that. So I guess the way we've been kind of addressing U.S.-China relations, it seems like both sides looks at it as sort of a zero-sum game. I think it would be fair to say, as there can only be one kind of superpower. And therefore that affects how both sides sort of looks at foreign policy and how it relates to each other as well as the rest of the world. So there's a question here about sort of how those views can be more nuanced, and also, I guess, we live in a globalized world where there are more than two powers, right? It's not just US and China, and there are other entities at play here. So maybe also lumping in that question of how do places like Europe or other parts of East Asia play into this relationship?
Well, look, it's a big world, and we don't do that world justice by boiling it down to two countries that have, and I totally agree with Michael, and that's sort of what I wrote about in my own book a few years ago. There have been extraordinary gains from this collaborative interdependence or codependence, and they're now at risk. But by focusing on conflict, which certainly has been escalated dramatically in the last couple of years of this trade war that was started by the Trump administration. We've dragged a lot of other important nations into the conflict as well. You're either with us or against us. And we've utilized our security umbrella to make certain that, Japan is on our side. Music there. Maybe are we nearing the end of our allotted time here?
That's not coming from us.
It's not coming from me.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, it was a nice interlude from somewhere. Look, as I said, it's a large world, and the problem with where we are right now is that there's a lot of pressure, and it's largely, again, being brought to bear by the United States to disengage from the multilateral institutions that have played a critical role in bringing the world together. whether it's, you know, the latest, the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization, or the Paris Agreement on climate change, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, these were opportunities for the U.S. to play a leadership role in allowing nations to speak with one voice, not dominated by just the United States or by China. And so I think we need to, you know, in trying to answer that question that you framed, Devin, it really, to me, hinges on our commitment to the multilateral architecture that underpins globalization as a really powerful force that can take the world to a better place rather than lead the world down to a tougher place. And if nations are willing to cast aside the progress that has been made, in the context of this globalization, then I think that will be a tragic outcome, not just for the two economies that we're talking about mostly today, but for the rest of the world. And I think it's important for the rest of the world to stand up and speak loudly in defense of this collaborative, interdependent approach that has played such an important role in creating this worldwide prosperity.
I mean, I'd add to that that I think one of the issues going on is you know, both countries are trying to make other countries choose sides, right? Which side are you? Are you going to be pro China? Are you going to be pro US? You know, that way of work during the Cold War, but this situation is vastly different than the Cold War, because the US and China and all these other countries have become so, as Stephen was talking about, so interconnected that it's not a simple us versus them kind of equation. So, you know, you see this conflict going on in, for example, places like Germany, with, you know, Germany has tremendous economic interests in China, has long-standing political ties and defense ties to the U.S. and economic ties. They don't want to choose, basically, and that's what you're seeing play out in German politics right now. So what makes this situation between U.S. and China going forward is that I think the U.S. and China are seeing it in bipolar zero-sum terms that you're talking about, and the rest of the world is kind of being there in the middle, saying we really don't want to be in the middle of this. You know, I don't know how this plays out. This is very, very different than between the Soviet Union and the United States, where there was much more limited interaction, economic and otherwise, between these two blocs that basically almost operated as if the other one didn't exist. That's not true anymore. Everybody has much more complicated entanglements and interests. I don't know how this plays out, and I think Stephen's right. I think Europe especially, but also places like Japan, other emerging economies that are important on the world stage, like India, they have to play a bigger role than they're playing in almost trying to moderate turning into a growing kind of bipolar confrontation.
Right. I guess in the interest of time, I think that's really, we'll probably have to stop there, but I think we can squeeze in one last word from both of you. And I like this question actually from Rebecca, and she asked, would it be possible to have a happy ending? What needs to happen for things to get better? And what is the best possible outcome for this? So maybe we can end with that.
Great way to end. I'll take a stab, and I'll be very brief, I promise. I just want to go back to and put my hat on as an amateur economic psychologist. codependent relationships end happily if both partners work on their own sense of self. And it applies to economies. If China focuses on the reforms that it needs to take itself to the next stage, that is the very best thing that China can do to improve its sense of self. And if the United States focuses on its structural challenges and puts in place policies that build a stronger US economy in the future without blaming our inability to do that on others like China, we'll be in much better shape. So self-improvement is the answer, and it would be a very happy one. But unfortunately, political leaders in both countries happen to be, very human with their own issues that may forestall that self-improvement.
Dr. Roach is recommending a very Confucian solution to this, self-cultivation. But unfortunately, I mean, I'd like to be happy, but it's very difficult. Maybe, I don't know, I'm a journalist, so I guess I'm prone to the negative. But I think what's really remarkable that's happened in the last 3-4 years is how China really has very few friends right now in Washington on either any part of the political spectrum. The whole tone of the debate, the whole view in America, I'm not just talking about people in Congress or the White House. I'm talking about think tanks. I'm talking about academics. I'm talking about the foreign policy and defense establishment. It's all turned to seeing China as much more of a threat. I don't think a change, if there is a change in the White House in November, I would expect that maybe the tone would be different and some of the tools would be different, but I don't necessarily think the view of a Biden government is going to be particularly different. On the Chinese side, Xi Jinping has told the country that he's going to make China great again. And he doesn't seem to be particularly interested in what the rest of the world thinks. When you look at what's happening in Hong Kong, there's been tremendous amount of international condemnation of his actions, and the Chinese seem to be completely unconcerned by this. So there's also been a change of attitude in Beijing, that they feel that they don't necessarily need to listen to the West anymore, or abide by the rules that the West has in place. I mean, unless there's some kind of significant a political shift, maybe brought about, as Dr. Roach says, by economic shifts, I don't know what the way out is at this stage. These political narratives are starting to get hardened into place.
Well, thank you very much to Michael and Steve for this wonderful discussion. It shows that this is a very, very important topic. There's still a lot of questions remain to be answered, and I'm sorry that we aren't able to get to all of them in the interest of time, but you can certainly go pick up Michael Schuman's Superpower Interrupted or Stephen Roach's Unbalanced if you're interested. And we look forward to hosting these types of discussions in the future. Please continue to follow us. And again, thank you very much, Michael and Steve.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it.
I'm going to unmute everybody so that they can also express their thanks to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.